Due to scheduling conflicts, the following interviews were conducted separately and then edited together. Hello and welcome to Sustain, a podcast of the Ngāora Whetū Centre for Climate, Biodiversity and Society. I'm Ben Goldson. Across the world, rising sea levels have become a pressing issue for coastal communities. Driven by our changing climate, sea level rise is already having a range of impacts, from increased flooding to the salinization of freshwater resources. To discuss this growing threat, we have Professor Karin Bryan from the University of Auckland's School of Environment, Professor William Glamore from the University of New South Wales's School of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and Dr Richard Bulmer, the Director of private consultancy group Tidal Research. So to begin with, Professor Bryan, why does sea level rise occur, and how serious of a problem is it?
Sea level rise occurs for two main reasons. The first reason is that our oceans are heating up and they're expanding, just getting bigger. And the other reason is that our ice is melting, and that's causing those are the two main reasons for sea level rising.
And I just saw from our co-director Jacqueline Beggs, there was a recent statement from the Australian Antarctic Research Conference warning of a catastrophic sea level rise in Pacific nations due to the melting of Antarctic ice sheets.
Yeah, the Pacific nations are particularly vulnerable, and that could happen. So
how is this all measured?
Well, sea level rise is measured in a couple of ways. One of them is using a satellite altimeter, so measuring the surface of the ocean, and the other is using ground-based water level sensors. And we have a network of water level sensors around New Zealand that we can validate those measurements with.
And do those work with the university?
It's not something that we do. It's the National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research runs a number of sensors. Ports and harbours run sensors, and also the regional councils have sensors. And those all together form our sea level rise network.
And so what sort of communities are most affected, and in what ways?
Well, basically communities that live and make use of low-lying land. That can be farming communities. They can be communities that rely on that low-lying land for other activities, like avocado farmers. It can be communities that rely on the intertidal regions for their, collecting shellfish. It can be communities that live at the coast for cultural reasons. The people that are particularly vulnerable to sea level rise are people that don't have anywhere to move to, so poorer communities.
Along with the slow creep of rising sea levels, what role do extreme weather events play in eroding coastlines?
That's one of the misconceptions about sea level rise. If you look at the most realistic projections for the next 20 years or till 2050, sea level rise is most likely to be around maybe 20 to 30 centimeters, something in that ballpark, which doesn't seem like much. But the problem is not the elevation of the mean sea level, it's the high tide and the storm surges and the storm events on top of those. And so those storm events are becoming increasingly more frequent around New Zealand. We had a direct hit of a Cyclone Gabriel, and that really sort of brought home how vulnerable we are to these kinds of events.
And then also, presumably, the heating of the ocean plays a factor as well?
Well, the heating of the ocean is incorporated into the sea level rise projections, but that heating is a source of energy for storms and cyclones as well. And so that is why one of the reasons that the storm events and cyclones are increasing.
Okay, Will, and coming over to you, so looking specifically at wetlands and rivers, what role do they play in maintaining coastlines?
Well, thanks for that. The really interesting bit is if you think about a river as a hose, and when we crank the hose up, the hose at the end flips around every which way. And you can see that a river itself is like that, and that the river wants to go all across the floodplain. It wants to move around, particularly when the flows are up high. And the wetlands do a great job of trying to hold it in place. They say, no, right now we're going to grow here. And the more we grow here, the more established we are, the more we're going to keep that hose from flying each way and all around. And so they do a great job of sort of locking the place in And that gives us all the other services that come with that. And if it's locked in place, then we can live comfortably, we can establish our farms, we can live in our cities. And that's the beginning of the whole process. That's the first step we need in order to actually have a landscape that we can then get the services that we want out of it.
So how are they then negatively affected by rising sea levels?
There's a view of a river that the river itself is just the river channel, and that this river channel is pretty much anything above the river channel is no longer the river. But as the sea level comes up, or as the river comes up, this whole system gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, if sea levels come up really fast, they will push out the landscape, the ecosystems that are on the river side. So if you've got salt marsh or mangroves, as sea level rise comes up, it just eats away into that landscape, and there's no place for it to go. If we allow it to go, if we allow the river to naturally go into the floodplain next to it, then there's some room for everything to move. But if there is no space for it to retreat into with sea level rise, we have this thing called coastal squeeze, and it just squeezes it down to eventually there's no wetland left there. It's just river going into landscape where we live.
And then presumably there's something of a snowball effect where these natural features are degraded, leading to more sea level rise, which then further degrades them.
Yeah, that's I guess our big fear is that if the sea level rise comes up faster than the ecosystems can adapt, eventually they all drown out. And if all the ecosystems drowned out, then they die and decay. So as soon as they start decaying, then there's nothing left. Now the whole system just drops away, and now the problem becomes much, much worse. So you've got no ecosystem there to protect us, and you've gone from it just keeping up with sea level rise to now it all being dead and washing away. So much bigger problems, and it's definitely a snowball effect.
Are there any other negative impacts caused by humans on wetlands and rivers?
I tend to work in the systems that are tidal. So that's the very lowest part of the river system where the tide goes in and out. And what we've done is over decades, and particularly in the 19th and 20th century, we've gone through and drained the landscape lower and lower and lower and lower to eventually drain the lowest bits. And the draining of those lowest bits has caused probably the worst problems. Now, that's where we've ended up with acid sulfate soils and black water. And we've had all these big issues happening because we've actually drained the lowest bit. So now the things that they were providing, like flood risk or ameliorating floods or reducing carbon or providing fisheries, those are the things that we've chewed away at. And so now we have a lot less fish in the rivers than we did before. And we produce a lot more carbon than we ever did before. And the flood risk is a lot higher than we ever had before. So yeah, by going through that process and developing them all, we've actually made it a lot worse for ourselves.
Because wetlands have traditionally been seen as something that needs to be drained and rivers need to be controlled. Would you like to see a sort of a change in mentality towards these natural features?
Yeah, there's definitely been this interesting approach where we've said, as I mentioned before, the river is no longer the entire river system. It's just that little channel that it lives in. That's what we think about when we think about rivers now. That thing it lives in when it's hardly flowing at all, not the big thing when it busts out of its banks and floods. And so we've broken that link between the river and the floodplain around it. And as soon as we did that, we said, that's the river down here and we live over there. We then justified that we should dump all our stuff in there. So that meant we could dump all of our products that we put in there, all of our wastewater, all of our pollution, and most of our ways of legislating or planning for rivers was how much can we dump in the river before we kill it all? That's largely what we've done. And, that's been death by 1,000 cuts. So I would love it if we actually said, instead of what is the maximum amount we could do to a river before we kill it, actually, what do we want from these river systems, and how are we going to change that view so we can get the most out of it, not just the minimum amount?
And so how do we restore wetlands and rivers to what they once were?
We've taken an approach that we don't look backwards to what they once were. We look forward to what they can be. I've done a bunch of work with traditional owners of the land and traditional occupants of the area. And they view it as, well, when would we go back to? How far back would we look then? Are we looking back a couple of hundred years ago when European colonizers arrived? Are we looking a couple of thousand years ago or tens of thousands of years? That's been a real eye-opener to me because it meant, no, actually, we need to look forward as to what to do. And if we're restoring forward to how the landscape we've got can adapt, then we're starting to think about, well, how does the system work? And that's what we've gone. In the last 25 years, I've restored thousands and thousands of hectares. And we started with a real basic understanding of how they work. And now we've moved to a better sort of life cycle understanding of if we can make a system that is good for all the different life cycles of the wetland, that wetland will thrive. And if we get it wrong for just one part of the life cycle, virtually the whole thing dies. So we've got to work to understand how the system works, adapt to what's coming, and then try to put all those things on the one side. And that's been really successful where we've been able to apply it.
And so do these measures take place at more the local level, or is it sort of a top-down, state-led approach?
Look, the scale is really important. So traditionally, we've started at the local level. We run pilots at the local level, and we get the one site right and show that we can do it well and prove to the community that this is not a risk, this is a benefit. But to go from that pilot to a much bigger piece where we're actually restoring lots of wetlands at scale, we definitely need to be thinking about urgent action that integrates policy and planning and finance and science. All those things have to be working together if we're going to do this in the time and space we've got available to us.
Do you ever encounter any sort of pushback on this, either from communities or businesses?
The idea of change is challenging for some people. And so what we're finding is the system is well set up now in most places for restoration within public lands. So lands that are owned by the public, that the public good, they certainly are pretty open for restoration and to do this. And we've been doing that for a long, long time. Where we're getting the biggest pushback is because we don't have good mechanisms to do it on private land. You can't just take private land that's providing a good to the landholder away from them and say, no, this should be now restored. We've got to work out how does that work for them? And how do we change that so they get benefits as well?
Do you think there would be much benefit to pursuing a sort of legislative approach to this, or do you think you need to more just get people on side?
Now, right now, one of our biggest challenges is not the science of how to do it, but the legislative hurdles. So for us to restore a site, say for us to restore a tidal wetland or a salt marsh or a mangrove system, we've got to go through the same legislative hurdles that we would have to go through if we were building a 7-Eleven on that same site. We've got to go through an EIS or an environmental impact statement or a big assessment that costs millions of dollars, even though everyone knows what we're doing is having a nature positive outcome. And that's because the way the legislation was set up was that everything you're going to do is a risk. It was presumed everything was bad. And so if we could have supportive legislation for restoration, that would be a game changer. That would mean that, yes, if you did these activities, you could get it through without the huge cost of all the legislation. That would be great.
So turning over to you, Richard, what form do the current efforts towards restoring coastal ecosystems take?
Yes, there's a range of different restorative actions occurring at the moment. There's examples like mussel-bed restoration in the Hauriki Gulf and Ohiwa Harbour. There's seagrass restorations in Nelson Estuary and salt marsh restorations in the Bay of Plenty. But generally speaking, they're fairly small scale, often community-led or heavily reliant on voluntary input.
Okay, so you'd say these are not really sufficient?
Yeah, not sufficient to turn around environmental degradation at the national scale. So we need to do more to turn that round.
And would you like to see that come from a sort of government-led approach, or do you think it can work from the bottom up?
I think both ways is necessary. One of the limitations that we've had has been this focus on kind of needing perfect information or predictions to address ecosystem decline. But I think we need to get out there and start doing some restoration and supporting the communities that are doing it and learning from them. and using that to inform like a larger scale restoration effort.
And so just rewinding a bit, so then how do these efforts then help bolster the coastline against sea level rise?
Yeah, so if we're thinking about coastal blue carbon habitats, they themselves provide coastal protection. So if we were to support restoration efforts that, say, restore salt marsh in the Bay of Plenty, you're not only going to have a benefit of coastal protection, but you'll also have other ecosystem benefits from that, like water filtration benefits or biodiversity gains. And there's also likely to be carbon gains as well.
And I guess just to wrap up, would you like to share any final thoughts on this topic?
So I think for me, the big issue is that even if we stopped all of our emissions today, and we produce no more carbon into the atmosphere, sea level rise is going to continue, right? It's baked in. The oceans are going to kick up, and we're going to have the lowest lying lands impacted the soonest. So the lower you are in the landscape, the more you're going to be impacted by sea level rise. And if you think about that hockey stick of sea level rise, people know it sort of goes along and then it kicks right up. So it will come faster than we think. And a lot of the work we're doing shows that that low-lying land, with the bits that's causing us all our problems, is the bit we can restore really quickly. But we need solutions that are going to be urgent, that are going to be scalable. And right now, those things for me are market-based solutions. If I use the market to do something, I know I can do it at scale and fast. So, I guess my final thoughts have been that we need to create markets for the public sector and for the private sector that will encourage change and make it happen. We need to incentivize it and stop trying to use the stick over and over again and start using the carrot as something to incentivize change, because that will happen quickly.
Yeah, so I guess I've kind of covered it a little bit there, but my observation is that we've got a problem with the marine environment degrading, and we really need to do more. Coastal restoration is an opportunity to turn that round. We need to utilise the knowledge that we've been developing for things like the Sustainable Seas Challenge and as part of other research projects where we can lever those sort of approaches to inform our decision making and make decisions in these sort of uncertain or complicated systems, but still actually move forward. And carbon, and because that's my area of focus, is one way that you can help understand the value of a coastal restoration action, but that's not the only thing that's of importance. So there's many other ecosystem benefits that are provided by these systems, and it's important that we better understand and communicate their benefits to inform restoration action and restoration in response to impacts like sea level rise.
Okay, and just getting back to that, so what are some of the challenges in communicating these benefits?
We don't have perfect data necessarily to inform exactly what these habitats are doing and where, but we can provide a pretty good assessment of their value. Literally just communicating things like a salt marsh has a benefit not only from a carbon gain, but also from a coastal protection, a water filtration, and a biodiversity perspective is valuable for informing these restoration actions. It also can enhance the amount of potential financing that you can get for a restoration as well. So we know that agencies like the Nature Conservancy and Conservation International are interested in supporting restorative action in the coastal blue carbon space. And we know that if we can better communicate those other values of these systems, it's more likely to result in an increased financial support for this restoration action, because we know that it's not necessarily cheap as well.
Yes, and actually speaking of data, it sounds like a good time for you, Professor Bryan. Final thoughts?
My final thoughts. I think my final thoughts is a healthy, adaptable coastal area actually requires space. And around New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand, we're facing what I would call, what everyone calls a squeeze. The sea level's coming up in the front, and we've often got stop banks and buildings and houses in the back. And in order to restore and protect and move us forward into the future, we actually need space. And so some of the communities that are having most struggles and will have most struggles is because they've got no space to move, they've got no space to build a new wetland, and to let that wetland migrate landwards. Facing that, we need to figure out clever ways of bringing us into this future where sea level rise and storm surges are going to be much more common. And we need to think of really clever ways of how we can do that in a very limited space that's getting increasingly squeezed.
Are there any of these sort of clever ideas coming through the pipeline right now?
I hope so. Yeah, we're working on that at the moment. We're developing new ways of mapping the coast, ones that use different kinds of signals. For an example, the different colors of our coast, using hyperspectral imagery. We're using NSAR data, which is the satellite-based surface level that we can track changes in the level. We're looking at using drone-based technologies to look at emissions and costing that up at the moment. It's fairly expensive, totally new for New Zealand, but if we can get that off the ground, I think that would be a really added benefit. And we've got colleagues from the School of Computer Science that are looking at novel AI techniques to ingest that information at much greater speed.
All right, well, maybe we can get you on in about a year's time to talk about some of these.
That'd be fabulous.
All right, well, that's pretty much all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us on Sustain.